Would you stand up for a veteran being wronged? Here's how one young man turned a terminal into a movement. The crowded terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport was filled with the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and murmured conversations among the travelers. A Marine veteran named Thomas stood near gate C-23 with his German Shepherd, Max, by his side. The pair were not hard to miss. Thomas, mid-40s, wore a weathered leather jacket and a cap embroidered with the word Semper Fi. Max, sporting a service dog vest, sat attentively, his deep brown eyes scanning the crowd as if always on duty. Thomas wasn't just another passenger. Having spent several years abroad and gone through the fights of readjusting to civilian life, Max had become more than a faithful companion. He was Thomas's lifeline, trained to identify and respond to anxiety and panic attacks that otherwise haunted him. Flying was never easy for Thomas, but Max made it livable. Together, they were booked on Flight 172 to Los Angeles, where Thomas was scheduled to attend a veterans advocacy event. As boarding began, Thomas approached the gate agent with his ticket and Max's documentation. But instead of the routine acknowledgement he expected, the agent frowned and began scanning through a tablet. "I'm sorry, sir," the agent said hesitantly, "but there is an issue with bringing your dog onto this flight." Thomas blinked, confused. "Issue? He's a registered service animal. I have the papers right here." The agent glanced at the line forming behind Thomas and lowered her voice. "It's a new airline policy. Some animals aren't permitted on the flight, even if you have documentation." Passengers passing by were slowing down, their ears catching snippets of the conversation. Thomas's voice was steady but had a frustrated edge to it, and it grew firmer. "This dog is not a pet. He's a service animal. Do you understand what that means? He's here for my medical needs." The agent shifted uncomfortably. "Just following protocol, sir," he said. Thomas felt his owner's tension and nudged the leg gently with his nose. He felt as if he were anchored in that moment, but his patience was wearing thin. That wasn't good enough. "I served this country. I didn't ask for the struggles I came back with, but I'm doing my best to manage, and you're telling me I can't board because of some arbitrary rule?" The exchange wasn't just between Thomas and the agent anymore. Passengers began exchanging looks, some murmuring quietly among themselves. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped out of line to watch, his arms crossed. A young mother cradled her toddler in her arms, stopped her conversation and looked intently, but she wasn't alone in her observation. The whole train was beginning to feel a build-up in the tension. Thomas was frustrated and annoyed, but that was the most obvious emotion Max's calm showed amidst the tension growing around gate C-23. People were now starting to make murmurs of outrage at what they were watching. "Are you kidding me?" an older man in a baseball cap muttered to his wife. "That man fought for this country, and now they're giving him grief over his dog?" The gate agent, now visibly flustered, glanced at her supervisor, who had just arrived to assess the situation. "Sir," the supervisor began with a rehearsed calmness, "we understand your concern, but the airline has updated policies. We can't make exceptions." Thomas's voice rose, steady but commanding. "Exceptions? This isn't about exceptions. It's about rights. You don't get to decide that my service dog isn't valid because of a policy you barely understand." Max stood up, his body pressed against Thomas as if to silently reassure him. Passengers in line started stepping closer, their curiosity quickly turning into indignation. "This isn't right," said a young woman holding her boarding pass. "If it were a pet, fine. But that's a service dog." A man in his 30s pulled out his phone and began recording. "People need to see this," he said to no one in particular. "This is ridiculous." The supervisor sighed, clearly feeling the weight of the crowd's attention. "Sir," he said firmly, "we can try to rebook you on another flight where this won't be an issue." "That's not the point," Thomas snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm not just some guy with a dog. Max is the reason I can even step foot in an airport. You think rebooking solves anything? This isn't just about me. It's about how people like me are treated." The crowd around Thomas began to grow. A mother with a stroller moved closer, her brow furrowed. An elderly woman clutching her carry-on nodded silently, pursing her lips into a thin line. The man filming spoke up. "Hey, aren't service animals protected by law? This doesn't seem legal." The supervisor hesitated and glanced nervously at the camera. "We're just enforcing the airline's policies," he said, but the conviction in his voice faltered. Thomas turned to the crowd, his voice louder now. "Do you hear this? After everything I've been through, they want to deny me basic respect because of their policies. Is this what we've come to?" The terminal fell silent, the kind of silence that comes when people are unsure of what to do next. The tension in the air was thick, the frustration almost tangible. But just as it seemed the situation might spiral further, a calm yet firm voice cut through the noise, drawing everyone's attention. The crowd turned toward the source of the voice. Standing just a few feet away was a tall, composed young man who seemed oddly familiar. His clean-cut appearance and calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the escalating chaos. It took a moment for the crowd to connect the dots, but the realization spread like wildfire. "It's Barron Trump," someone whispered, loud enough to confirm what others were thinking. Barron, carrying a small backpack and a boarding pass in hand, stepped closer to Thomas and Max. His voice was steady but carried an authority that belied his youth. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the supervisor directly. "What's going on here?" The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "This gentleman's service dog doesn't meet the updated requirements for this flight." Barron frowned, his gaze shifting to Thomas and then to Max. "Doesn't meet the requirements? This man is a Marine veteran, and that's a service dog. What part of this situation seems okay to you?" The crowd, emboldened by Barron's presence, murmured their agreement. A woman nearby spoke up. "Exactly. He's not asking for anything unreasonable." Barron's tone remained calm but had an edge to his words. "I'm pretty sure federal law protects service animals regardless of airline policies. Are you seriously willing to break the law over this?" The supervisor's confidence visibly faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but Barron continued. "This isn't just about rules, it's about doing the right thing. Imagine what this man has been through and now you are refusing him dignity over a technicality." Thomas, who sat silently the entire time, finally broke his silence. "I never thought someone would stand up for me like that, but thank you." Barron nodded toward him before looking back at the supervisor. "I recommend that you call up someone in higher authority to solve this problem, because if you don't get it resolved today, it is going to snowball into an even bigger mess." The man who had his phone recording the whole event chimed in. "You've got people filming this from every angle. Do you really want to be the face of this story when it hits the news?" The supervisor, now visibly sweating, pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Let me speak to the manager on duty," he said, stepping away. Barron turned back to Thomas and extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, sir." Thomas shook his hand, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his frustration. "I've seen a lot of things in my life, but this is a first. You didn't have to get involved, but thanks." Max appeared to calm a bit, his tail wagging faintly as if he picked up on the mood shift. But as these words had begun to turn the tide, this resolution was far from being certain yet, and so the crowd watched, holding its collective breath to see what happened next. When the supervisor ducked into the nearest office and made a call, the atmosphere changed in the terminal. What had started out as a quiet squabble now felt like a group standing together. Passengers drew in closer, their voices increased, some filming, others speaking up openly about their frustration. "This is bigger than airline policy," a man said when he was 50 years old to no one in particular. "What happened to good common sense?" "It is disgusting," added a young mother walking by with her stroller. "A Marine veteran and his service dog? This shouldn't be up for discussion." Barron stood tall at Thomas's side, speaking up to the people. "We can't sit here and allow things like this to occur. It's a matter of standing up even when it's an inconvenience. What does that make us if we don't stand up?" The crowd murmured in agreement. An elderly woman grasping a cane stepped forward. "Son, I've lived through a lot and I've learned one thing. When someone's in the right, you fight for them. You don't let them fight alone." Applause spread throughout the room, shocking the gate agents standing behind the counter. One of them whispered to her coworker, casting nervous glances toward the growing crowd. Thomas looked around, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't even know what to say. For years, I felt invisible, like no one saw what people like me go through. But today you're making me feel like I matter again." Max moved closer to him, his stable presence anchoring Thomas in the present. A teenage boy stood up, notebook in hand. "Sir, may I shake your hand? My grandfather was a Marine too." Thomas smiled weakly and reached out to the boy, shook his hand. "Your grandfather must be very proud of you." The gate supervisor came out once more, looking worn out and anxious. He cleared his throat and stepped toward Barron and Thomas. "We've discussed this with the management of the airline, and they've decided to make an exception in this situation." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Thomas held up a hand for silence. "An exception?" he said, his tone measured but firm. "This isn't about exceptions. Undefined, it's about doing what's right. For me and for every veteran or person with a disability who comes after me. Undefined. Max and I deserve more than a one-time pass." Barron nodded in agreement. He's right. Undefined. This isn't over. Undefined policies like these need to be reviewed. People shouldn't have to fight for what's already protected by law. The supervisor, clearly uncomfortable, muttered, "We'll take that feedback to the appropriate team." But the crowd's energy had already shifted. This wasn't just about Thomas anymore, it was about something bigger. Something everyone felt they had to fight for. The cheers gradually died down as the supervisor took a step back, his effort at control slipping through his fingers. Thomas adjusted his stance, taking a deep breath. He did not want a temporary victory, he wanted true change. Barron seemed to sense this, stepping closer to Thomas and speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't about one flight or one vet," Barron said, standing up to speak to the gate agents and everyone else in line. "This is about being respectful to individuals who have so much given this country. The policies that happen like this one aren't simply inconvenient, they are hurtful. We will ensure this incident is looked into at the corporate level." Thomas turned to Barron, his appreciation obvious in his face. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have just sat there and watched." Barron shook his head. "If we stand by and do nothing, we're part of the problem. My father always told me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." The supervisor gestured toward the boarding area. "Mr. Thomas, Max is cleared to board. We'll make sure you're seated comfortably." Thomas nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though his voice remained steady. "Thank you, but I hope you'll think about what this means for the next person in my shoes." As Thomas and Max walked toward the gate, the crowd erupted into applause, not just for them but for the principle they represented. People smiled, clapped, and called out words of encouragement. Barron lingered for a moment, watching as the pair boarded the plane. A woman in her 30s approached him. "That was unbelievable," she said. "Most people wouldn't have spoken one word." Barron smiled slightly. "Most people care, they just need someone to remind them they can make a difference." Thomas stepped back from the jetway, looking at Barron with newfound focus. He raised his hand in a gesture of thanks, his face a mixture of relief and determination. Max, seeming to intuit the magnitude of the moment, wagged his tail once before trotting after Thomas as he boarded the plane. But then, with that door closing on the plane, what had transpired truly registered with those who remained. A shared reminder of how it feels to stand up to one another. The terminal settled into its pattern again, but the energy left behind was different. People exchanged knowing glances and quiet words over what they just witnessed. Strangers who may have otherwise simply passed each other by now feel a bond forged in a moment, standing up for something right. Thomas sat by the window on board Flight 172, Max sleeping faithfully at his feet. He stared out at the tarmac, finally feeling the adrenaline of the encounter subside. For the first time in a long time he felt seen, not as a veteran but as a human being whose pain and dignity had value. Sitting a few rows back was Barron Trump, who did not seek attention or validation for what he had done. His reward was knowing that he had done it when it counted. A flight attendant approached him quietly, saying, "Thank you for what you did back there. You made a difference." Barron simply nodded. "We all did." As the plane took off, the crowd at gate C-23 dispersed, but many still carried the story with them. Social media posts were already circulating with hashtags like #RespectOurVeterans and #ServiceDogsOurHeroes trending within hours. The video of the incidents was going viral with thousands of comments praising their bravery, especially that of the young man leading the charge. It was just one moment that did not happen in a blink of an eye but reminded that little things create waves and bring about others doing the same. The moral here is that there is no answer to silence when injustice prevails. Compassion and courage are contagious. When one person stands up, then others feel empowered to do the same. The video ends with the voice of the narrator providing the final statement. We all have a choice. Whether it's a crowded airport terminal or the quiet moments of everyday life, we can choose to act, to speak, and to stand for what's right. Let today's story remind us that when we stand together, change is possible. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of standing up for others. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of what truly matters.